2, 1.
Hello everybody, once again from Central Valley Geeks Studio here in downtown Los Banos. We're continuing with our part 2 of the History of Los Banos saga. We want to call it that? We discussed quite a bit about the Henry Miller influence, initially the Native Americans that were here previous to that, the influence from the Spanish missions on the other side of the hills, and we're going to hopefully be able to finish today with up to current time. I'm with Dan Nelson. He is on the board of the Milliken Museum, and you're quite a historian basically of Los Banos. He has some really good content. He was born and raised here in Los Banos, and quickly fourth generation in the Merced area from the late 1800s, correct?
Mhm.
Okay, so a lot of history just in his family legacy. So let's continue. We left off at the old stage stop, the first post office, and like I said, we'd covered all of and if you saw part 1, you know what I'm talking about. We covered Henry Miller, his influence, his initial purchase of land and the irrigation canals and all of that. So let's start at right after the first post office was established in 1873. And then we move into transportation evolution into the valley.
Right, right.
So let's talk a little bit about steamships. Perhaps the railroad had an influence at some point. So go ahead, let's talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, well, I when I'm thinking about the history of the West Side and the history of Los Banos, I organize my thoughts generally in 2 different eras. One is pre-railroad and post-railroad. And as we had talked about earlier, the development of the West Side began in the late 1850s and 60s by the immigration of Europeans, and then Henry Miller bought his first piece of land in 1863, which led to some development of the West Side, enough to a point of where they had a couple of stage stops, of which one ultimately got a post office in 1873, and that post office was named Los Banos. And so that is the first time that the name was used other than the naming of Los Banos Creek by the Padres. So this region became known as Los Banos, and after the creek. The other background leading up to the railroad, and the other background that led to the development of the West Side, was also the development of an irrigation system. And the first canals that were built, and the one that goes through Los Banos, was actually built in 1871. And so that opened up a whole new, different way for agriculture and irrigation, further away from the San Joaquin River, and changed things significantly. All of that led to the development of old, what we now refer to as Old Los Banos, south of Volta, on Volta, what is now Volta Road. And that little community was a vibrant community. It had a hotel and a bar, of course, and a blacksmith shop, and it was kind of the center of all the activity for a long time. Come 1889, the Southern Pacific Railroad built the railroad through the west side of the San Joaquin Valley. And prior to that, the only transportation you had to the west side was through either stagecoaches and through the stage stops, or through the San Joaquin River, which had steamships, but was really volatile, so they couldn't use it all that. It was either too low or it was too high, and so it was very limited on the transportation. But once the railroad came through in 1889, everything just opened up and people started moving into the area. Henry Miller decided he wanted to have a town next to a ranch that he had called Canal Farm, and he wanted to also have the town next to the railroad. And so he actually picked up the buildings, including the post office, of what was old Los Banos. He essentially picked it up and moved it here to where he wanted it. And so it's good to be king, right?
That's amazing. Yeah, that's crazy. I love that.
And so he essentially moved the town from where it was out there on what currently is Volta Road, moved the town to where it is today. And there was a little bit of a competition at the time because Volta was already a community, a little community as well. And it wanted to establish itself as, being sort of the center of the West Side. But for whatever reason, Henry Miller, didn't want that. And so he built the city here. He built some beautiful foundational structures. One was a general store. That was the first building that he built. And that is on the southwest corner of Main Street or 6th Street and I, and across the street from the Bank of America. And it had, as you might imagine, the Old West general merchandise store. It had a little bit of everything. It had groceries, it had furniture, it had all the provisionals that you would need, and then upstairs it had offices. And so that was the first major building. It was a beautiful brick building. Just a couple years later, he built what I would consider as being the nicest building that Los Banos has had, and that was the Los Banos Hotel. And that was a big, beautiful 3-story brick building, and that was on the northwest corner of that same intersection of 6th and I, where currently the Bank of America is at. And so this was this beautiful 3-story hotel, and it brought people in from all over the place, and it was sort of the centerpiece. A few years later, he built the Opera House. And so Los Banos actually had an opera house. And it was on the northeast corner of that same intersection. And then a few years later, he built a very large bank, a Miller and Lux Bank, the First National Bank. And so on the intersection of 6th and I, you had these 4 big, beautiful buildings that Henry Miller had built, and this was over a course of about 15 years, of he built all 4 of those, and that was the foundation of the development of the town, had those structures in place. But so everything was sort of, there was another little town called Center Point that is out there right on Artigalita Road. That was also another stage stop. They also picked up all the buildings there and moved them here as well. So all of these little stage stops that had developed in the 1870s and 1880s, essentially they were abandoned. And there were some little communities on the San Joaquin River, the closest one being Dover, where there was a little community right on the river, just, where currently J14 or Mercy Springs Road goes over the San Joaquin. Just a little to the west of there was a little town there as well. That ultimately was moved over to Merced because the railroad went through there. And so,
now, is there any remnants of that small town?
There are foundations left,
okay.
And that's pretty much it. Just the foundation, and that's it. Yeah.
I wonder if that would be a historical landmark kind of.
Yeah, well, that is one that we think has a lot of potential to be a historical landmark. Another one is the Dickinson Ferry, which is about a mile downstream on the San Joaquin from J14, and essentially that was initially the route that folks from Los Banos took to get over to Merced, was to the north, and where the elk preserve is today, it's just right on the river there, right on the elk preserve. Yeah, and there was a ferry that went across there and a little hotel. But all of those were abandoned once the railroad came through and everything was consolidated, and all the railroad towns started popping up, like Los Banos and Dos Palace and Gustine.
Right.
And Hills Ferry was moved into Newman and Patterson. And
So was the rail trail, is the rail trail, the old rail line?
Yes.
Is that the original?
that's the original.
Line.
That was the railroad.
And if we
where
follow
the
it-
Henry Miller statue is today,
Yes.
that was where the depot was.
Oh, nice.
Yeah.
Wow, that would have been nice to have.
Yeah, it's one of those things in retrospect, it would have been nice to, it would have been
Yeah.
nice to preserve.
Unfortunately. Now, let's go back to the Opera House, because where was that again?
The Opera House was right across the street from the bank, where the Bank of America
Okay, so
is
the Miller,
today.
the current Miller Lux building.
Yeah,
And that was upstairs?
Yeah, it was upstairs, and downstairs, there was, the post office was moved in there, and a lot of little retails. There was a liquor store and a cigar shop and a barber shop and a lot of little stores, you know, on the ground floor with the Opera House. Beautiful, beautiful Opera House with the stage upstairs, and they had dances there.
Right, I was gonna say, that's where somebody had told me that there used to be these big bands that would
Yeah.
come there, and it would just be packed with
Yeah.
people dancing.
Yeah,
Get dressed up really nice,
yeah.
and that was like the Saturday evening.
Yeah, it was a
event.
very ornate building.
Yeah,
Very
wow.
ornate building, and yeah, it was
Does
the
that-
center of activity in town.
Is that upstairs part, because I mean, I think a lot of people have gone into the Miller Lux, the lower level.
Yeah.
For whatever events might have happened in there.
Yeah.
But the upstairs is still intact?
No,
or
not at
is
all.
it?
The building is entire. In fact, the Los Banos Hotel, the Opera House, and the whole block between 6th and 7th Street, north of I Street, that whole block burned down
Oh, it did?
in the fire of 1919. So we
Okay.
lost all of those buildings and a
Um,
major part of the town in 1919. And it was just a devastating fire, and it apparently started off at the second floor of the hotel, or a little bar right next door. And as is common in Los Banos, we have a wind coming from the northwest, and you know, once the fire started, it just kind of took off, and it jumped the street and burnt the Opera House and that whole block there. Yeah, that was. We
I've
lost
heard
a
about
lot of really good, neat old buildings at the time.
That's too bad.
Yeah.
So the Miller Lux building then was rebuilt, and what is upstairs at this point? I mean,
Yeah, actually, when that fire, when that area of town burned down, Miller and Lux actually started construction. They were going to move their bank, the First National Bank, that was on the south side of that intersection, and they were going to build a big bank where the Opera House was, and so they initiated construction of that in about 1920, 21, and ultimately, you know, during the course of time, you know, things got tough, and the Bank of Italy took it over, and so that big building that is there today was built in the early 1920s, and essentially it became the Bank of Italy.
Okay, so I had been told that the Bank of Italy was actually located on the Bank of America corner, but it actually was in the Miller Lux.
Yes,
building.
yeah,
Okay,
that
gotcha.
was, yeah.
Thank you
and-
for clarifying that.
And
'cause I
Miller and
just
Lux
told that
initiated the
recently.
construction of that building. That is still, that's the big prominent building that's there today.
Okay.
They initiated construction, but ultimately the Bank of Italy took it over.
So speaking of that,
Yes.
let's move into, you know, the melting pot, as you call it,
Yes.
and kind of discuss the influence or the immigration of the Europeans.
Yes. Well, the Basque and the Basque came and started using the grazing lands, especially up in the foothills. They came early, and the Arbrua family, I think, was the first Basque family that came to the area. And you know, that was in the 1860s, and right about the same time as Miller and Lux coming in. Once Miller and Lux came in, Henry Miller really appreciated the work ethic of the Italians, and so there was a connection. A guy by the name of J.T. Toscano, one of the initial Italians to come to the region, he became sort of the connection of where he would call back to the area where he was from and tell them, you know, if you come to United States, you know, come to California, and we have jobs for you. And so he became sort of the connection, and so the Italians started coming into the region through that connection. And like I said, Henry Miller appreciated the work ethic and their capabilities, and so he would put them to work. And so we had a lot of Basque and Italians fairly early on. The Portuguese began moving into the area after 1889, and they came in with a lot of dairy expertise. And once you had the railroad coming through, you had a way to export, you know, the dairy products.
Yep,
so you could expand the dairies in the region, and so it was primarily after, you know, the railroad came through when the Portuguese started moving in, and they were able to export to the Bay Area, you know, their milk products. And so that's when they came in. And then you always had an element of both Spaniards and Mexicans in the region as well. Henry Miller really valued the vaqueros that were in the region when he got here. They were already here, of course, through their history of being, you know, a major part of California's history. And but Henry Miller really valued their abilities with horses and horsemanship, and so they actually were the original cowboys for Henry Miller's ranches. And then ultimately, so there was always an element of Mexicans and Spaniards that were here. And then the Bracero program in the 1940s, you know, expanded that for ag labor and that sort of thing.
Sure.
So it really, Los Banos is truly a melting pot. It really does have a diversity of cultures, and of course, you know, the folks from Oklahoma that came in, you know, during the Dust Bowl, you know, that added to the culture as well, and the local melting pot, and it really is part of the essence of Los Banos, is the diversity of ethnicities.
That's interesting. Yes, and that's true. I mean, it's phenomenal.
Yeah.
And then we continue to see more of a melting pot even these days. I know that there's a Filipino American club in town. There's some Filipinos that have moved to town, and they started a Filipino American club, and other variations. But it's just a nice story of the necessity of labor, basically, is what brought most of them. Now, I wanted to talk a little bit about the Italian, and so I know that there is a contingent of Italian families here in town where there was a region of Italy that most of those families came from.
Yes.
And that's because of the Toscano knew those people in that region?
Primarily, yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, that clarifies that, because I always wondered, talking to people that have been here, have had, you know, family history of 100 plus years, and they say, oh yeah, it's interesting because, you know, this, but I never got the backstory to it. So this is interesting that that's the reason.
Yeah. It was a little community called Grimentinova, and Grimentinova is on a hilltop. Small little community, I would say, of about 1,500 to 2,000 people, and it's in the southern part of Italy, the south central part of Italy, and they just had this connection, you know, through Toscano was the initial person from Grimentinova, as far as I'm aware of. Also another family called Saramelli, where part of the initial families that came to the region from there. But there was just that connection.
Yeah.
And recently I did go to Grimentinova, and when you go through the cemetery there at Grimentinova, it's like you're walking through the Los Banos Cemetery. I mean, you have the Velascos and the Germinos and
Wow.
you know, Toscanos and the Brandys, and it really is
amazing.
It is amazing.
Wow. That connection.
Yeah.
Just kind of a side note, didn't we have some government representatives came to visit us from there?
Yes.
a few years ago?
Yeah, we did. And in fact, Griminton and Los Banos are sister cities.
Right, okay.
Yeah, and
That's
so they've developed a relationship.
Because I actually met them.
Yeah.
At the city council chambers.
Ah,
They were
okay.
there.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was kind of interesting to meet, and unfortunately, none of them spoke English very well, but they knew what it was all about.
Yeah,
right?
a lot of
So-
smiling and nodding.
Yeah, of course, right, very cordial people.
Right.
So, let's go, to move, kind of change channels a little bit, we'll go back to, kind of rehash, well, in more detail, that
Sure.
fire
Yeah.
of 1919, and then kind of the reconstruction efforts after that. You touched on that a little bit, but let's get into it a
Sure,
little more.
sure, and even a little background to the fire of sort of the development of the city. There are a couple other things that that are noteworthy. The 1906 earthquake, San Francisco earthquake, that actually, the one that burnt down the whole city of
Sure.
San Francisco, yeah, that actually had a big impact on Los Banos as well. Those buildings like the general merchandise store, the hotel, and the opera house all had major damage with the earthquake, and so there was a rebuilding of sorts, right then as well, and then that led to the fire of the other challenge that Los Banos had through its growth and development were fires, the most notable being the 1919 fire. Another fire going back, the first notable fire is probably was in 1900. We had a big, beautiful schoolhouse on the corner of K and 6th Street, just across from where the Arts Council building is today, out in that area. There was the first grammar school was built there, and that burnt down in 1900, and that was a major fire. And then the next fire was in 1919, and it burnt the whole block it burnt the portion along 6th Street, what was the Los Banos Hotel and the Portuguese Bank. There were a couple of buildings that it burnt right along 6th Street. It jumped over 6th Street, into the eastern side of 6th Street and burnt everything between I Street and to the railroad, and just burnt the entire block down, including the Opera House and a livery stable that was there, and a couple of old hotels, Lissart Hotel, and so Los Banos essentially was faced with, in the 20s, just a reconstruction in effect. And so most of the buildings that you see today are all post that fire.
Okay.
Yeah. In 24, there was another fire that was on I Street to the west of 6th Street, and it was the old Masonic building, and that was constructed fairly early on. I think that was 1923, 24 when that burned down, and that was another big blow. It was a nice building.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's too bad. And did they rebuild that at all? Or?
They did. Well, they rebuilt it in a different place, and
Oh, okay.
so yeah, and so but that was pretty much it with the building. And by the way, the Los Banos Fire Department just recently came out with a really well done history of the development of the fire department and the history of the fire department. And in doing so, there's a lot of good history of just, the history of
Sure.
Los Banos as well.
Yeah.
So I'd encourage you to, take a look at that book. It just has come out in the last month or so.
Yes,
And
yeah.
they really did a good job.
I haven't seen the book fully, but I've seen pictures of it.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
it's pretty neat to see
It is,
the
it is.
old way that they used to fight fires and equip the firehouse.
Yeah.
Quite interesting.
And the other thing that was noteworthy, of course, is the incorporation of the city. Although the railroad came through in 1889, and that's when they began developing the buildings, it wasn't incorporated until 1907. And what motivated the incorporation of the city was actually they wanted to develop and build a sewage system. Most of the sewage systems were kind of open drains and open ditches throughout town. Most notably, there was the alley that runs between I Street and H Street, say behind Woolgrowers, as an example, that alley behind Woolgrowers, that used to be just an open ditch, and the sewage used to run into this open ditch through the middle of town, you know, and then run out. And so it got kind of rank at times, and that's actually what ultimately motivated the city to incorporate so they could levy taxes and build a sewage system and that sort of thing. So, but that was in 1907.
That was in '07.
Yeah.
Interesting. That, I didn't know that, well, of course you don't think about that stuff.
Right.
That's interesting to hear that was the plumbing of the era, of the times. So then, there was a building boom that started in about 1920.
Yeah. A lot of construction and most of the buildings that you see downtown today were built in that era, in the 1920s, 1930s, and in fact, really a phenomenal, relatively speaking, a phenomenal amount of growth occurred at that time. Los Banos really began to take root in the 1920s and 30s, and people began to move in. Most of the housing was to the west area, J Streets and K Street, 4th Street, right in through there. At that time, 4th Street was the end of town. And in fact, they had planted eucalyptus trees all along 4th Street back in the 1890s. And there was just this big, huge, you know, windbreak, in effect, that was on the west side of 4th Street. There was a ditch that ran through there, a canal that ran through there, and the eucalyptus were on each side. But that was the edge of town. But all of that was starting to develop in the teens and the 20s, and things began to expand from there in the 20s and 30s.
Okay, so those houses were, that explains where those houses were initially built and the architecture of those homes.
Yeah.
I like driving through there and just
Right,
seeing those,
right, yeah.
that time of
Yeah, it was built,
architecture.
there's still a lot of 1890 houses that are still there,
Sure.
you know, in that region, and on this side of 4th Street, in the downtown area now.
So the boom started in the 20s and 30s.
Yeah.
And was that primarily due to the dairy industry?
Well, it was, you know, it was a combination of just people moving in for agriculture. Land was available. Miller and Lux had expanded quite a bit, and Miller and Lux began after the death of Henry Miller in 1916. Miller and Lux began selling some of their lands, and so just a lot of opportunity for folks to move into the region.
Right, totally. Okay. So then we'll move on to, so Henry Miller passes away in 1916. They start selling off segments of land all up and down California.
Yeah, pretty much. They were consolidating somewhat. They had a lot of tax debt, and agriculture had changed quite a bit. Henry Miller was a butcher, and he was in the meat market, and that's what he did. And even the ranches that he bought in this area, he was certainly a great cattleman as a result of that. But the reason he was a cattleman was so he could provide his slaughterhouses with good quality meat.
Sure.
And so he was fundamentally a butcher.
Yeah.
When agriculture started becoming more diverse with irrigation and row crops and that sort of thing, Henry Miller was he fundamentally wanted to maintain his ranches and his irrigated pasture. He really didn't diversify too much into row crops and other types of things, and so ultimately in the 20s things really were becoming a lot more diverse as far as the crops that were being grown in the area and that sort of thing. And so you know, Miller and Lux began selling off a lot of their historically irrigated pasture land, and it was being developed for row crops.
Okay, very good. So let's move up a couple of decades to the 1950s. You know, you mentioned the construction of the Delta Mendota Canal, and then 10 years after that, or so, the San Luis Reservoir. So let's touch a little bit on on those two really major water projects.
Sure, sure. As most communities in California and the United States as a whole, the post-World War II era was a very good time, a good economic time for California, and certainly a lot of expansion. A lot of the military were coming home and building houses and starting families, and certainly that was true of, you know, the Los Banos area as well. Los Banos, you know, experienced a lot of growth during the late 40s, early 50s, and
Sure.
and part of that was also the expansion of the irrigation system. The federal government was building a huge project in California called the Central Valley Project, and it included, you know, Friant Dam on the east side of the valley, Shasta Dam, a big pumping plant in Tracy, and in this region, significantly, was the construction of the Delta-Mendota Canal. And so we had a lot of families coming into the region that were both working on the canal, and also those families that were moving in that were taking advantage of the benefits of more water coming to the region, and a lot more farmland was opened up as a result of that. And so it was a period of growth for Los Banos in the 50s and 60s, and really stabilizing. And again, I'm talking relatively, if I recall correctly, I think in the 50s and 60s the population was about 5,000–6,000 people, and up from a couple thousand prior to that. And so I'm talking relatively.
Sure, sure, yeah, of course, right? I'm sure we could scrutinize some documents at the Milliken Museum and really get down to the
We could,
but,
we could.
But no, that's fine. That's actually funny, Dan. But so the Delta-Mendota Canal brought in some permanent residents. There's a number. If people have driven through town or just driven by, especially a couple of really cool. Well, we're filming during Christmas time, so there's some really cool light displays in a couple of people's houses down on the Santa Clara, Santa Rita, that neighborhood. I don't know what you would call that neighborhood, but there are houses that are relatively identical in a certain number of streets on the east side of town here, just before Mercy Springs. Now, I was told that those homes were actually built for the workers that built the dam.
Yes,
Is that
that's
true?
correct. Yeah, the next major water project that really affected the area fundamentally was the construction of San Luis Reservoir. And that was, that project was both an expansion of the federal Central Valley Project, but it was also a joint project with the state in building the state water project. And so San Luis Reservoir is as a result of a partnership between the state and the federal governments on building a massive statewide water system. And but I believe the groundbreaking ceremony was in 1962, and President Kennedy actually came out for the groundbreaking, and it was a big celebration. And as you can imagine, you know, constructing a dam like that is a tremendous amount of labor it takes to do that, and a lot of that labor moved here to Los Banos and was settling here in Los Banos. And so yes, there were different housing tracts that were developed just almost exclusively to try to accommodate the folks coming in and working on the dam. I can recall I was in about seventh grade at the time, and the schools, as you might imagine, were just overwhelmed by the influx of new kids coming to school. And we actually had to, while we were constructing new schools, such as the high school, during that period, we actually had to go into double session for the school district. At 7th grade, I think we got to school at about 7:30 in the morning, if I remember correct, and we were out about noon, 12:30. And then the 8th graders would come in and use the same facilities from 12:30 to about 5 or 5:30. So
Wow.
we actually had double session, if I recall correctly, a couple of years there before the new high school was finished in about 1965, 66.
And were you using what is now Los Banos Elementary? Was that, what was the school?
Yes, yeah, there was Los Banos Elementary on 7th Street, and where the elementary school is today, that was the old high school.
Okay.
And then once that was finished, once the high school, gosh, I want to call it the new high school, but Pacheco's the new high school. Yeah, the new high school in 1965. Once that high school was finished, then, you know, they moved the junior high to where the elementary school is.
Okay.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
But it was this whole complex right in through
Yeah,
here.
yeah.
And Henry Miller School was constructed at the time, and so there was a lot of folks out there too.
Interesting.
Yeah.
How much, thank you, Dave, how much time, well, during that time, how did the population grow? By how much?
Yeah, my recollection is that, you know, beginning the construction was 5 or 6,000 people, and it seemed like almost overnight it went up to 12 to 14,000. So yeah, and then so it just doubled, you know, almost literally overnight.
Wow.
And
Yeah, that's fantastic.
yeah, as
can't even
you might imagine, it just kind of changed everything.
Sure.
And then there was actually a sort of a hangover after the dam was finished. There were a lot of empty houses in town.
Sure.
As the labor moved out, but that backfilled over the course of several years and
Okay.
in the 70s, and then a little later on, it would be about the 80s when we started seeing our first commuters come into Los Banos because of high prices in the Bay Area and over in Silicon Valley and San Jose. A lot of those folks started moving into the valley for affordable housing, and so we saw the next spurt of growth.
Sure. Yeah, actually, my family, me and my wife moved here in '89 for that reason.
Yeah.
So, definitely saw that. Now we're starting to see that
Once again.
take off once again.
Yeah.
So we'll see how we do with that kind of growth. That's fantastic. Well, that kind of concludes pretty much part one and part two of a two-part series, in my opinion, of the history of Los Banos, the influences of, well, first the Spanish and the Mexicans into the area, the coexistence of them with the Yokuts. Was it the Yokuts?
Yokuts.
Yeah, Yokuts.
Mhm.
And then all the way through, with the largest influence being by the German, and I don't remember his actual real name,
Heinrich Chrysler.
Heinrich Chrysler, who came across the country on a ticket that was not transferable, owned by a guy named Henry Miller. So Heinrich actually took on the name so that he could get passage, and he was actually going up to San Francisco for the gold rush. The part of and actually I wanted to kind of touch on that because since we're kind of at the end of the thing, I wanted to go back and so the story is that he showed up in San Francisco with $3 or $6, $5 in his pocket, and apparently I just heard an enhancement to that, which was when he was making passage across from the East Coast down in Panama or somewhere, he caught malaria.
Yes.
And he had a whole bunch of money with him. I don't know, I remember how much exactly, but he had a good sum of money with him that he was going to take and do something in San Francisco during the gold rush. He was taken care of and actually recovered from the malaria, but because he was out of it, when he woke up, he only had about $3 or $6 left in his pocket after his illness. Is that?
Yeah, he didn't have too much money. He came from New York to San Francisco. He was in New York for a couple of years and really hadn't accumulated too much money, but he was stable.
Sure.
But yes, he He got sick as they were coming to San Francisco. He got sick in Panama, and pretty much, whatever he did have, he lost there while he was recovering. And
Right.
he was, I think it was about 6 months he was in Panama trying to recover, and almost didn't make it.
Right.
And but yeah, he got into San Francisco with pretty much nothing.
Yeah, okay, so that was another gap in the stories that I had heard, which
Yeah.
I just went, wow, that's a crazy, how did he even get across with so little money to begin with? But now we know. And then also to kind of fill in a couple little spots. So the canal, there's a main canal that runs through town. What's the historical significance of that canal? I don't remember if you touched on it or not,
Yeah.
but if you did, I forgot.
Well, that canal began delivering water in 1871, and the canal system was actually motivated by a bunch of entrepreneurs, large financiers of early California, and they came into the region with this grandiose idea of this canal system for the west side of the valley. They needed easements from Henry Miller to put the canal system in, and so what Henry Miller wanted in return was a piece of the action. He wanted a percentage of the company. Once he saw the benefits of irrigation, shortly after water started flowing in 1871, he became senior partner and took it over and expanded it from there. And so, but that canal was actually dug in 1871 from Mendota, from where the San Joaquin runs near Mendota. From there down to Los Banos Creek was the first stretch, and it was referred to as the main canal. And like I said, the first water that flowed through it was in 1871, and it's been in use ever since.
See,
And expanded from.
I mean, you drive across those bridges across that, and you're crossing a nearly 150-year history
Right.
that you didn't even think about.
Right.
And
right.
it just blew me away when I heard that. I just,
Yeah.
and that was just tremendously interesting connection to that
Yeah.
water. And then finally, before we close out here, I wanted to talk a little bit about just one piece, and what we'll do is we'll come back with Dan, and we'll actually talk a little bit more in depth about Henry Miller, the man,
Mm-hmm.
and the ranch owner of what ultimately turned out to be at least Los Banos, and beyond.
Mm-hmm.
So we'll do a whole series, or at least an episode on Henry Miller, the man. But one of the things I'd heard just recently, again, another story that I'd heard about him, and just kind of shows you the kind of person he was. I know that he was a hardcore businessman. Obviously he wanted Los Banos to be here, so he moved all those buildings from Volta,
Right.
and he had that happen.
Right.
I also understood that, or had heard that he was a creditor to quite a few people,
Yeah.
and fellow farmers and things like that he had loaned money to, and they were having problems paying him back. And the story goes that, and maybe you can just elaborate a little bit on it, that at one point he got his I don't know what you want to call him, his financial consultant or his CPA or whatever, to call all of those people in one at a time and talk to them about how much they owed. And that at some point he realized that, he basically said, okay, how much can you give me by tomorrow? And those people would say, well, I can give you this much. He said, fine, you bring me that much tomorrow and I'll forgive the rest of your debt. Is that?
Yeah, and that's just one of many, many colorful stories about Henry
Yeah.
Miller. But yeah, there was a period of time where he wanted to just kind of reconcile things and to sort of clean up his books. And as the story goes, as you said, he called in his debtors, and essentially said, this is what you owe me. What can you do? And they would say, well, this is what I have, and this is what I can do. And he essentially said, okay, that would be good, and just wrote off the rest. And but as I said, that just one of many, many very colorful stories about the man. He really was an enigma, and and he was a ruthless businessman and a shrewd businessman. On the other hand, once the business deal was over, you know, he would help you out however
Sure.
it is that he could help you out and help, you know, he was well known in the cities and well respected, and he was, another interesting story about him, he had, you know, many ranches all over the place.
Right.
And that's sort of how he organized himself. He would have a ranch center such as the Santa Rita Ranch and the Canal Farm Ranch, and he had, you know, between here and the Dos Palace area, 17 ranches, and each independently run with foremen, and there were a lot of hobos and homeless people that used to move through the area, and you know, they would just slaughter a cow and eat what they could and waste the rest, frankly, or they would, you know, burn down, you know, some of the haystacks and that sort of thing. So he actually initiated a program called the Dirty Plate Programs, of where when his crew were done eating at each ranch, they used to all of the workers came in and they fed all the workers, and when they were done eating, all of the other hobos could come in and eat, you know, they would bring them food, they would have to eat off the dirty plate, so they called it the Dirty Plate Route, but hobos would go from ranch to ranch.
Wow.
But, you know, they as a result of that, he didn't have anyone, you know, stealing his
Sure.
beef, or slaughtering and wasting his beef, or burning down haystacks. And
Quite shrewd.
yeah. So he was, like I say, he was an enigma. He could be really hardcore and shrewd. On the other hand, he was very generous and very gracious and very hopeful.
Sure.
To a lot of the farmers and the immigrants in the area.
Yeah, that's. I mean, Henry Miller, in conclusion, had such a positively huge influence in the valley itself, and I think in California, since he was the largest landowner for quite some time. Right?
Yeah. You're absolutely right, John. He changed everything. When you look at it, he changed the face of the valley. He initiated, you know, how it is that we do agriculture in this area. Sure. He built the towns of the region, you know, all of the towns of the region, Dos Palace, Los Banos, Gustine, you know, he built all of the towns on the west side of the valley. He was certainly the father of this region, and the major influence on the development of the region, no doubt.
Right, that is just, the historical significance of Henry Miller, and the fact that you really don't hear about him outside of the area.
Yeah.
In any historical way, which blows me away.
Yeah.
The one place that you can learn more about him, besides our nice discussions that we're going to continue to have, hopefully, if you're up for it.
I'd love to.
Is at the Milliken Museum.
Yeah.
And again, it's located?
Yeah, it's located here at Pacheco Park, and right across from the Foster Freeze, and it's open every day except Mondays from 1 to 4.
1 to 4.
Yeah.
A lot of details, a lot of pictures and images, and hopefully we'll be able to get some of those still photos from the old days.
Yeah.
And intersperse them with our videos as we do continue to do these online
That'd be great. We'd be
conversations.
happy to do that.
I can't thank you enough for your time, Dan.
Yeah, it's been a
your
pleasure.
just your wealth of history.
Uh,
This will not be the last time we see you. Definitely, because there are this Los Banos specifically, but in general, the surrounding area of Los Banos is just so rich in culture and history that it makes me comfortable to know that I will have a lot of content ongoing for hopefully many years, where we can shoot video of all of the historical significance in this town, along with the community and cultural events that occur throughout the year. But this was a great start. This is going to be published hopefully within the next, next two weeks or so. Well, you'll see it probably, since we're filming this just almost a week before Christmas,
you'll probably see it somewhere well, you're seeing it now. So, at any rate, it will be coming out.
I really want to take the opportunity to compliment you as well. This is a great project, and
thank you.
I know it's a major undertaking, and I know you put a lot of time and effort in it, and I really want to thank you and to compliment you on the project.
Thank you very much. Well, Dave Hogue gets probably
Yep.
95% of that. He's got a lot of time and finances invested in this project going at this point, and maybe that leads us to conversation a little bit, which we'll talk about. The MyLosBanos.com website, the shopper that Dave promotes. We're starting to look into ways of kind of recovering some of Dave's out-of-pocket expenses that have been incurred and will continue to be incurred as this project, because Dave really has been the executive producer and sponsor at this point. If you're interested in helping out Dave in relieving some of the costs, the overhead costs of the videos that you'll be seeing on the website, please contact Dave Hogue at Central Valley Geeks here downtown Los Banos. If you've had your computer worked on, you probably brought it here, and you know who he is. Great man, knows his stuff computer-wise, but also has a great passion for what we're doing together, and I think anything would help. But contact Dave. He's also helping develop the Milliken Museum website, which hopefully will be available in early to mid 2018. So you'll be hearing updates on that as we go forward as well. The next episode will be, I believe, what we're probably going to do is have you back, and then we're going to talk about maybe in depth, and maybe Jose is our cameraman, so thank you for doing this for us. But maybe, Jose, we can actually have that episode filmed at the Milliken Museum itself.
Oh, that'd be great.
And then we can actually show photos of Henry Miller
Sure.
that exist. I don't even know how many pictures. I've seen a couple of his pictures, but and if that's okay with you and the Milliken Museum organization, that we could do an in-house interview at that point.
Oh, no, we'd like to do that.
And then January?
That would be after this episode, but in our current calendar, it would be in January, but whenever you see this, hopefully maybe we'll have actually published the other one as well, but we'll see. It's kind of a new thing for us, so please bear with us. This isn't live. I think of it as live because we're doing it live, and the timing and all that, but just hang out with us. We really appreciate your patronage. We really appreciate having you go out to MyLosBanos.com and clicking on the links to watch these videos. And as well, as much as anything else, constructive criticism and kudos will be greatly appreciated. But please make sure it's constructive criticism. Anyway, thank you for the Honest members for coming out. Again, big thank you to Dave Hogue for making this possible, greasing the skids and getting all the equipment together, getting everything together. And we will catch you guys at the next episode. Again, come to Central Valley Geeks to get your My Los Banos shopper. And also, if you have any questions, Dave continues to update the MyLosBanos.com website with current information about this project, as well as a bunch of other events and whatnot here in town. So stay tuned. Thank you very much, and we'll see you next time.